The first person who looked alarmed wasn't Rhett Alexander. It was Gregory Whitman, his wife's attorney. Rhett, a 42-year-old software company owner from Portland, sat quietly in a gray conference room while Vanessa demanded full ownership of Alexander Ledger Systems. Most people believed he ran a modest tech business. The faded Tacoma, the worn flannel shirts, the gas station coffee didn't help. What they didn't know was that one signature could transfer control of contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. Then, Gregory lowered the settlement document, leaned toward Vanessa, and whispered something that made the color leave his face. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, drop your country and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you like long-form stories about patience evidence and unexpected justice, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. 12 years before Vanessa Alexander demanded ownership of the company, Alexander Ledger Systems existed on a folding table inside a rented garage in Beaverton, Oregon. The garage smelled like sawdust, old paint, and damp concrete. Rhett Alexander spent most nights there, not because he loved suffering, because he couldn't afford an office. The folding table held 2 monitors bought from a liquidation sale. The desk chair squeaked every time he leaned back. During winter, he wore fingerless gloves while writing code because the small space heater barely worked. At 30 years old, Rhett had left a stable software position at a healthcare technology firm outside Portland. Most people thought he was making a mistake. Some said it directly. His father had. A former coworker had laughed when Rhett explained his business model. "You want to build software for small clinics?" the man had asked. "That's the plan. There isn't any money there." Maybe there wasn't, at least not at first. But Rhett had noticed something most larger companies ignored. Independent medical clinics were struggling. Their billing systems were outdated. Their patient payment records were disorganized. Insurance processing delays were costing them thousands every month. Large software vendors wanted hospital contracts. Nobody wanted the smaller clients. Rhett did. So he started building, one clinic, one contract, one problem at a time. The first customer was a family practice office in Salem. The contract was worth less than $6,000. Rhett celebrated by buying takeout Chinese food and working another 6 hours. The second client came 3 months later. Then a dental group. Then a pediatric practice. Slowly, the company grew. Not dramatically. Not the kind of growth that attracted magazine covers. But steady, reliable. The kind that survives. Around that same period, Rhett met Vanessa. She was working for a luxury branding agency in downtown Portland. Vanessa was smart, confident, socially effortless. The kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new contacts. At first, Rhett admired that. He wasn't naturally outgoing. He listened more than he spoke. She filled silence easily. The relationship moved quickly. Vanessa liked ambition. Rhett certainly had that. Back then, she seemed fascinated by his determination. When she visited the garage office for the first time, she laughed. Not cruelly, at least not then. "You seriously run a company from here?" Rhett smiled. "For now." Vanessa looked around. The folding table, the extension cords, the whiteboard filled with handwritten notes. Then she shrugged. "Well, every billionaire starts somewhere." At the time, Rhett believed she meant it. Maybe she did. The early years were difficult. There were months when payroll came before everything else, even before his own salary. Several times Rhett delayed paying himself entirely. Employees never knew. Clients never knew. The burden stayed on him. That was how he preferred it. By year 4, Alexander Ledger Systems finally moved into a small office building near Portland's Pearl District. Nothing impressive. Brick exterior, old elevator, shared parking lot. But it was theirs. Rhett still remembered carrying the first server rack inside with 2 employees on a rainy November morning. They ordered pizza afterward. Nobody talked about becoming rich. They talked about surviving another year. That was enough. The company specialized in one thing: making complicated healthcare payment systems simpler. It wasn't glamorous. Nobody bragged about billing software at parties, but medical providers loved it. Because it worked. Client retention climbed above 94%. Referrals increased. Contracts became larger. The company expanded into neighboring states: Washington, Idaho, Northern California. Through all of it, Rhett maintained the same habits: same practical truck, same modest clothes, same routine. Most mornings began before sunrise: coffee from a local diner, then the office. Vanessa's life moved in a different direction. Her social circle became wealthier, more polished, more image-conscious. Private charity events, wine tastings, fundraisers, exclusive networking dinners, people who measured success by appearances. The contrast slowly grew. At first it seemed harmless. Small comments, little jokes, nothing dramatic. One evening after a fundraising gala, Vanessa introduced Rhett to a group of executives. "This is my husband," she said. "He owns a little software company." Little. The word lingered. The executives smiled politely. The conversation moved on. Rhett said nothing. He rarely did. But he remembered. Over the years, similar moments accumulated. Not enough to start an argument. Enough to leave a mark. Whenever someone asked what Alexander Ledger Systems actually did, Vanessa often simplified it. Or dismissed it. Boring healthcare software. A niche business. Nothing exciting. Meanwhile, annual revenues continued climbing. 8 million, 12 million, 17 million, then 23 million. The company remained privately held. Rhett owned nearly everything, not because he was greedy, because he had built it from nothing, and because every attorney, accountant, and advisor he worked with had insisted on careful documentation from the beginning. That habit would matter later, more than anyone realized. Every ownership certificate, every shareholder agreement, every intellectual property filing, every software patent application, every board resolution, everything was organized, everything was stored, everything was backed up. Some founders treated paperwork as an annoyance. Rhett treated it like armor. His legal records occupied entire secured servers. His attorneys occasionally joked that he documented things like a government agency. Rhett never laughed, because he knew memory changes. Records don't. By year 10, the company had become something very different from the garage operation where it started. Alexander Ledger Systems now managed payment infrastructure used by hundreds of healthcare providers across the Pacific Northwest. The software processed millions of transactions every month. Compliance requirements became stricter. Security protocols became more complex. The stakes increased. But publicly, very little changed. No flashy headquarters, no sports cars, no luxury magazine features. The company remained almost invisible. And so did its founder, which suited Rhett perfectly. What few people understood was that the company's most important opportunity had arrived quietly. Over 18 months, Alexander Ledger Systems had been negotiating with Northwest Health Alliance, one of the largest regional healthcare networks in the state. The discussions were confidential. Only a handful of executives knew the details, including Nathan Cole, the Alliance's operations director. The potential contract would transform the company. Not overnight, not through hype, through scale, long-term revenue, institutional credibility. The kind of agreement competitors spent years chasing. Rhett never discussed it publicly, not even with most employees. Certain information remained protected until signatures were complete. But rumors occasionally surfaced, and Vanessa had begun hearing fragments, comments at events, questions from investors, unexpected interest from people who had ignored Rhett for years. She started noticing, started paying attention, started asking different questions. Questions she had never asked before. How much was the company actually worth? Who were its biggest clients? Why were healthcare executives suddenly interested in Rhett? One evening, standing inside their kitchen, she casually asked about a meeting he had attended in Seattle. Rhett answered honestly. Contract negotiations. Big contract? Potentially. Vanessa stared for a moment, then nodded. The conversation ended there, but something had changed. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking at the company as a boring software business. She was looking at it as an asset, a valuable one. And several weeks later, after another closed-door meeting with Northwest Health Alliance, Rhett returned to the office and found a message waiting from a financial controller. A routine report, nothing urgent, at least on the surface. But one transaction immediately caught his attention. The payment wasn't large, not compared to company revenue. Yet something about it felt wrong. The vendor name was unfamiliar. The authorization trail looked unusual. Rhett opened the supporting records, then opened another, and another. The office around him grew quiet as evening settled over Portland. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Inside, Rhett leaned closer to the monitor. A pattern was beginning to emerge, and for the first time he wondered whether the biggest threat to his company wasn't outside the building at all. The transaction was only $4,870. For a company generating millions in annual revenue, it barely registered. Most executives would have ignored it. Rhett Alexander didn't. The vendor listed on the expense report was Cascade Strategic Consulting. The name meant nothing to him. That was unusual. After 12 years of building Alexander Ledger systems, Rhett knew nearly every recurring vendor by memory. Software providers, cloud infrastructure companies, legal firms, security auditors, healthcare compliance consultants. This one was unfamiliar. He clicked deeper into the records. The payment had been approved through a secondary authorization process. Not illegal, not even improper on its face, just unusual. The billing address was in Seattle. The service description contained only 3 words. Marketing Consultation Services. Rhett stared at the screen. Marketing consultation. Alexander Ledger Systems didn't use marketing consultants. The company grew almost entirely through referrals and industry relationships. They had never needed them. The office had emptied around him. Most employees had already gone home. Rain streaked across the windows overlooking Portland's Pearl District. The city lights reflected against the wet pavement below. Rhett opened another report, then another, and another. Within 30 minutes, he found 2 more payments. Different dates, same vendor, same authorization pathway, same vague description. The total was now over $18,000. Still not catastrophic, but enough to deserve attention. He picked up his phone. Daniel, you still around? A pause. Then Daniel Price's voice answered. Barely. What's up? Can you come back upstairs for a minute? 20 minutes later, the company's CFO sat across from him. Daniel was the opposite of Rhett in many ways. Talkative, expressive, quick to react. But he was exceptionally good with numbers. Rhett rotated the monitor. You recognize this vendor? Daniel adjusted his glasses. No, neither do I. Daniel reviewed the records quietly. His expression gradually tightened. Who approved these? Rhett pointed. Daniel leaned closer, then exhaled slowly. Oh, he immediately understood. The approvals originated from Vanessa's administrative privileges. Not unusual by itself. For years, Vanessa had retained limited financial access for household-related reimbursements and event expenses connected to public business functions. Nothing extraordinary, at least originally. Daniel clicked through the records. Then another, then another. His eyebrows lifted. Rhett? What? You should probably see this. The payment history extended further back than either of them expected. Not 3 transactions. Not 5. 11. Over 16 months. The total exceeded $73,000. Silence settled across the office. Daniel finally leaned back. Want me to start digging? Rhett nodded once, quietly. Daniel understood immediately. No accusations. No confrontation. Just facts. That was how Rhett operated. Always. The investigation remained internal. Only 2 people knew it existed. Over the following week, Daniel reviewed records during spare hours. No announcements, no meetings, no drama. Meanwhile, life outside the office continued, at least on the surface. Vanessa spent more time attending social events than ever before. The marriage had become something strange, not openly hostile, not openly affectionate. 2 people occupying the same house while moving through different worlds. Most evenings, Vanessa returned home late. Fundraisers, networking dinners, private club gatherings, wine tastings, charity galas. Rhett rarely asked questions, and Vanessa rarely volunteered answers. One Friday night, they attended an event at the Portland Art Museum, a healthcare foundation fundraiser. Nearly 300 guests filled the hall. Executives, investors, doctors, politicians. Vanessa looked perfectly at home. Rhett looked exactly like himself. Simple navy jacket, no designer labels, no expensive watch, nothing that attracted attention. The difference had become increasingly obvious over the years. Vanessa surrounded herself with people who admired status. Rhett surrounded himself with people who solved problems. Those worlds rarely overlapped. Near the bar, Rhett found himself speaking with a hospital administrator from Eugene. They discussed software integration issues, compliance updates, patient billing workflows. The conversation lasted 15 minutes, useful, productive, exactly the sort of discussion Rhett enjoyed. Then Vanessa appeared. She smiled brightly, placed a hand on his shoulder, and laughed. You 2 are probably talking about spreadsheets again. The administrator chuckled politely. Something like that? Vanessa turned toward him. I swear, Rhett could spend 6 hours discussing software if nobody stopped him. More laughter. The administrator excused himself. Vanessa accepted a glass of wine from a passing server. You really need better stories. Rhett said nothing. She continued. People don't connect with spreadsheets. The comment sounded harmless. Most people would have forgotten it instantly. Rhett didn't, because it wasn't really about spreadsheets. It was about respect, or the lack of it. Years earlier, comments like that might have sparked an argument. Not anymore. Now he simply observed, stored the moment, moved on. That had become a pattern. The next morning, Daniel called. I found something. Rhett drove to the office. The conference room door closed behind them. Daniel opened a folder. Inside were expense reports, invoices, travel records, hotel confirmations, everything organized chronologically. Rhett reviewed them one by one. Seattle, Napa Valley, Scottsdale, San Diego, luxury hotels, business class flights, spa packages, private dining expenses. None of them appeared connected to company operations. Many occurred during periods Vanessa had claimed to be attending non-profit events. Daniel pointed to one document. This one stood out. The expense involved a 4-night stay at a luxury resort outside Napa. Total cost exceeded $9,000. The company paid for it. The accompanying justification listed Business Development Retreat. Rhett checked his calendar. No company retreat existed during those dates. No executive meetings. No conferences. Nothing. Just the charge. Then another detail emerged. The travel records weren't attached to any company personnel except Vanessa. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Want me to keep going? Yes. You sure? Yes. The answer came immediately, not because Rhett enjoyed what he was finding, because facts mattered, especially unpleasant ones. Over the next month, additional information surfaced. Not enough to prove anything dramatic, but enough to reveal a pattern. The company had gradually become a source of personal spending, not catastrophic, not criminal, just dishonest, and dishonesty had a habit of growing. Meanwhile, another shift was occurring. Vanessa's attitude toward the company itself was changing. For years, she had dismissed it. Now she asked questions, detailed questions, questions about valuation, ownership structure, corporate assets, long-term projections. One evening, she appeared in Rhett's home office doorway. "How much do you think the company is worth?" Rhett looked up from his laptop. "Why, just curious." He considered the question, then answered honestly. "Depends on the valuation method." She smiled. "You always answer like a lawyer." "No, lawyers charge more." She laughed. But her eyes remained focused, studying him, measuring something. The conversation drifted elsewhere, yet Rhett noticed the change. Vanessa was paying attention now, a level of attention she had never shown before. A week later, another event reinforced that impression. At a private gathering hosted by Olivia Bennett, one of Vanessa's closest friends, several guests discussed technology acquisitions. One investor mentioned healthcare software, another referenced recent consolidation trends. Then, someone unexpectedly mentioned Alexander Ledger Systems. Not Rhett. The company. The room's tone shifted. People suddenly seemed interested. Questions followed. Growth numbers, market position, healthcare compliance infrastructure, potential acquisition value. Vanessa listened carefully, far more carefully than usual. For the first time, Rhett saw something in her expression. Not admiration, not curiosity. Calculation. A quiet mental shift. The kind that happens when something previously overlooked begins looking valuable. Later that night, while driving home through downtown Portland, Vanessa remained unusually quiet. The city lights reflected across the windshield. Traffic moved slowly through the rain. Finally, she spoke. "You never told me people viewed the company that way." Rhett kept his eyes on the road. "You never asked." Silence returned. The answer bothered her. He could tell. Not because she argued, because she didn't. And Vanessa always had something to say. Back at home, she disappeared upstairs. Rhett remained in the kitchen. The house was quiet. Too quiet. For a moment, he looked through the dark window above the sink. 12 years. 12 years building a company. 12 years building a marriage. One felt increasingly solid. The other didn't. His phone vibrated. A text from Daniel. Only 6 words. "Found another authorization trail. You need to see this." Rhett stared at the message, then looked toward the staircase where Vanessa had disappeared moments earlier. Something told him the numbers weren't finished talking, and what they revealed next might change far more than a balance sheet. The next authorization trail began with a hotel invoice. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A luxury property in downtown Seattle. 3 nights, executive suite. Nothing unusual for a company that occasionally sent employees to conferences. Except no employee had attended a conference. Rhett Alexander sat in his office while Daniel Price projected the records onto a large monitor. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The city outside was gray. Inside, the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Daniel clicked through the documents. Reservation date, payment approval, expense report, corporate card record. Each piece connected cleanly. Too cleanly. Someone had taken care to make everything appear legitimate. "What was the stated purpose?" Rhett asked. Daniel opened another file. Regional Business Outreach. Rhett stared at the screen. No meetings attached. No conference registration. No client records. Daniel paused. Nothing. Silence filled the room. The problem wasn't the amount. Alexander Ledger Systems could absorb a $9,000 expense without difficulty. The problem was the pattern. Patterns revealed intent, and this pattern was expanding. Daniel opened another folder, then another. Napa Valley, Scottsdale, Santa Barbara, Palm Springs, different cities, different dates, the same style of documentation, vague descriptions, minimal support, corporate payment, personal benefit. One expense alone included nearly $2,000 in spa services. Another contained private wine tours. Another included luxury transportation charges, none of them connected to company operations. Rhett leaned back. His expression barely changed. Daniel noticed. Most people would have reacted differently. Anger, shock, immediate confrontation. Rhett never worked that way. Instead, he asked a question. "Can we verify every authorization?" Daniel nodded. "I'm already doing it." "Good." That was all. No accusations, no emotional speeches, just another problem requiring facts. The review continued for nearly 2 weeks. Every afternoon, Daniel quietly expanded the file. Every evening, Rhett examined it. By the end of the second week, they had assembled something substantial. Not devastating, not criminal, but undeniably damaging. The total amount exceeded $90,000. More concerning than the money was the consistency. The charges stretched across several years. They weren't mistakes. They were habits, and habits rarely improved on their own. Meanwhile, life outside the office continued as if nothing were wrong. Vanessa remained active in Portland's social circles. Charity boards, private fundraisers, networking events, dinner parties. Photographs regularly appeared online. Smiling faces, elegant venues, perfect appearances. To outsiders, the Alexanders looked successful, refined, stable. The reality felt different. The distance inside the marriage had become impossible to miss. Not because of dramatic arguments, because of the absence of connection. Most evenings they occupied separate parts of the house. Vanessa watched industry events and lifestyle content. Rhett reviewed compliance reports and development schedules. Conversations became shorter, less frequent, more transactional. One Thursday evening, Vanessa arrived home carrying several shopping bags. Designer stores, luxury brands, the kind of purchases that once would have sparked excitement. Now they barely registered. She placed the bags on the kitchen island. "Olivia's hosting another fundraiser next month," Rhett nodded. "Okay. We should go." "If my schedule allows." Vanessa looked irritated. "You always say that." "Because it's usually true." She crossed her arms. "You know appearances matter." Rhett finished reading an email before answering. "To some people." The response landed heavily. Not because it was rude, because it was honest. Vanessa stared at him. For a moment, it seemed she might continue the discussion. Instead, she grabbed a bottle of sparkling water and left the room. The conversation ended. Like most of them did. A few days later, another development emerged. Daniel arrived carrying a printed folder. His expression was more serious than usual. "I found something else." Rhett looked up. "What is it?" Daniel placed several pages on the desk. Authorization history. The documents showed user activity records from the company's financial platform. Every approval left a digital footprint. Timestamps, IP addresses, login credentials, everything. The records revealed that several expense approvals had occurred immediately before major personal trips. The same sequence repeated multiple times. Expense created, expense categorized, expense approved. Travel booked. The timing wasn't random. It was coordinated. Daniel tapped one section. This one bothered me. Rhett studied the page. The approval occurred less than 2 hours before a flight reservation to Scottsdale. The flight belonged to Vanessa. The expense description had been altered afterward, not dramatically, just enough to appear business-related. Daniel sighed. I don't like where this is going. Neither did Rhett. But discomfort wasn't evidence. Evidence remained evidence. Nothing more, nothing less. That distinction mattered. Especially in healthcare software. Especially in legal disputes. Especially in marriage. People often confuse suspicion with proof. Rhett never did. Over the years, he had learned a simple lesson. Assumptions create arguments. Records create conclusions. That philosophy guided everything he did. It also explained why Alexander ledger systems survived while competitors disappeared. The company documented everything. Every contract. Every security review. Every compliance audit. Every policy update. The same habit now protected him personally, not because he expected betrayal, because documentation was routine. Weeks later, another issue surfaced. This one involved system permissions. A routine security review flagged several administrative access requests originating from Vanessa's account. The requests weren't malicious, but they were unusual. Historically, Vanessa rarely accessed a tour's company systems. Now the activity had increased. Daniel brought the report directly to Rhett. She logged in 6 times last month. That's unusual. Extremely. Looking for what? Daniel shrugged. Hard to say. The report showed navigation activity, financial summaries, ownership documents, executive compensation records, corporate structure files. Nothing had been altered. Nothing downloaded. At least not yet. But the curiosity was obvious. Rhett read the report carefully, then closed the folder. For several moments he remained silent, thinking, observing, connecting pieces, the expense patterns, the questions about valuation, the sudden interest in company ownership, the increased system activity. Individually, none of it meant much. Together it formed a picture. A picture he didn't like. Later that afternoon, he scheduled a meeting with the company's outside legal counsel, not because he intended to take action, because he believed in preparation. The attorney reviewed the situation calmly. What are you worried about? She asked. Rhett considered the question, then answered carefully. I'm not worried. The attorney smiled slightly. You wouldn't be here if that were true. Maybe she was right. Rhett looked toward the window. Below them, Portland traffic crawled through evening rain. The city appeared calm, orderly, predictable. His life no longer felt that way. I just want everything documented properly. The attorney nodded. That's never a bad idea. By the time the meeting ended, several recommendations had been made. Nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational. Administrative safeguards, access reviews, documentation procedures, routine corporate housekeeping. Exactly the sort of measures responsible companies implemented every day. Over the following week, those changes quietly took effect. Additional approval requirements, updated permission structures, refined administrative access levels. Nobody announced them. Nobody complained. Except one person. 3 days later, Vanessa walked into Rhett's home office holding her phone. Her expression was controlled, but only barely. I can't access some of the company portals anymore. Rhett looked up from his laptop. The permissions were updated. Why, security review. Vanessa frowned. I've always had access. Not to everything. This is new. It is. Silence stretched between them. The tension felt different this time. Sharper, more focused. Vanessa wasn't angry about a missing password. She was angry about losing visibility. Rhett could see it. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Vanessa placed the phone on the desk. What exactly is going on? It was a simple question, but Rhett noticed something important. She wasn't asking about the company, she wasn't asking about security, she wasn't asking about compliance. She was asking what he knew. And for the first time, Rhett wondered whether she realized how many records already existed. Vanessa waited. The room remained quiet. Finally, Rhett closed his laptop. His voice stayed calm. Nothing is going on. Technically, the statement was true. No accusations had been made, no investigation had been announced, no confrontation had occurred. Not yet. But as Vanessa picked up her phone and left the room, Rhett found himself watching the closed door long after she disappeared. Because something had changed. Not in the company, not in the financial records, not even in the marriage. The change was simpler than that. For the first time, both of them knew the other was paying attention. And once that happened, there was usually no going back. The dinner took place on a Thursday evening in early October. Portland's rain had paused for once. The sky was clear. The city lights reflected off the Willamette River as guests arrived at the Portland City Club. Inside, the atmosphere felt exactly as Vanessa liked it. Polished, exclusive, important. White tablecloths covered every table. Crystal glasses caught the warm lighting. Executives moved from group to group, exchanging business cards and carefully rehearsed success stories. Rhett Alexander never enjoyed events like this. He attended because they mattered to Vanessa. Nothing more. He adjusted the cuff of his navy jacket and followed her through the ballroom. Vanessa looked perfectly in her element. Her black evening dress attracted attention. Her smile came effortlessly. She greeted people by name, introduced friends to investors, investors to nonprofit directors, directors to entrepreneurs. The room seemed to orbit around her. Rhett preferred standing near the edges, observing, listening. The same habit that helped him build a company now helped him survive social events. About 30 minutes into the evening, Vanessa guided him toward a table occupied by several guests. Olivia Bennett was already seated, so were two venture capital partners from Seattle, a healthcare consultant from California, and several local business owners. The conversation flowed easily. At first, wine arrived, appetizers followed, people exchanged stories. Then, someone asked the question Rhett always received eventually. So, what exactly does your company do? Before he could answer, Vanessa laughed. Not loudly, just enough to draw attention. Oh, don't get him started. The table smiled politely. Vanessa took a sip of wine. He runs software systems for healthcare billing. One of the investors nodded. That's a big market. Vanessa waved a dismissive hand. It's not nearly as exciting as it sounds. Several guests chuckled. Rhett remained silent. The investor looked back toward him. Still, healthcare technology has been growing. Vanessa answered again. Trust me, nobody comes to parties wanting to hear about billing software. More laughter. A few people glanced at Rhett, waiting, perhaps expecting him to defend himself. He didn't. Years earlier, he might have. Not anymore. The conversation shifted elsewhere, but the moment lingered. Because it wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the 10th. Vanessa had spent years reducing Alexander Ledger Systems to a joke. Not openly hostile. Not cruel enough to create a scene. Just small enough. Consistent enough. Public enough. 1,000 tiny cuts disguised as humor. Rhett understood something most people didn't. Respect rarely disappears all at once. It erodes gradually. One comment, one dismissal, one public correction, one private insult. Until eventually the absence becomes obvious. The dinner continued. Main courses arrived. Discussions turned toward business acquisitions, healthcare investment, regional growth opportunities. topics Rhett actually understood. Then a familiar voice appeared from behind him. "Rhett." He turned. Thomas Reed, 54 years old, former entrepreneur, early investor, one of the few people who had believed in Alexander Ledger Systems during its earliest years. The two men shook hands. Thomas smiled. "Mind if I steal him for a minute?" Vanessa smiled politely. "Of course." Rhett followed Thomas toward a quieter section of the room. The older man wasted no time. "I heard Northwest Health Alliance moved your proposal into final review." Rhett raised an eyebrow. News traveled fast. Apparently faster than he thought. "We're still talking." Thomas laughed. "That's not a denial." "No. It could be huge." "It could." Thomas lowered his voice. "Have they indicated contract value yet?" Rhett answered carefully. "Not officially." "But," Rhett glanced around, then spoke quietly, "if everything goes through, it changes the scale of the company." Thomas nodded immediately, because he understood exactly what that meant. A contract like that wasn't about 1 year of revenue. It was about credibility, long-term growth, institutional trust, market positioning, the kind of opportunity competitors spent years chasing. Thomas smiled. "I'm proud of you." The words landed differently than most compliments, because Thomas knew the entire journey, the garage, the failures, the uncertainty, the years nobody paid attention. Rhett appreciated that. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Then both men returned toward the main tables. What Rhett didn't realize was that Vanessa had noticed everything. Not the details, not the numbers, just enough. She had seen Thomas approach, seen the private conversation, seen the seriousness, and curiosity had already been growing. Now it intensified. Later in the evening, another guest approached, then another, then another. Several people wanted to speak with Rhett, not Vanessa. Rhett, healthcare executives, technology consultants, investors. The pattern repeated. Questions about growth, questions about expansion, questions about healthcare infrastructure. For the first time in years, Vanessa sat quietly while others showed genuine interest in the company. Something about it seemed to bother her. Not visibly, but Rhett noticed. Because he noticed everything. Around 10 o'clock, the dinner finally ended. Guests filtered toward the exits. Valet attendants retrieved cars. The cool Oregon air greeted them outside. Vanessa remained unusually quiet during the drive home. Streetlights slid across the windshield. Downtown Portland disappeared behind them. 10 minutes passed before she spoke. "How big is that hospital contract?" Rhett kept his eyes on the road. "Which one?" "The one Thomas mentioned." "It's confidential." Vanessa stared out the passenger window. "Confidential from your wife. Confidential from everyone." The answer wasn't emotional. It was factual. The negotiations involved non-disclosure agreements. Certain information couldn't be shared. Simple. Professional. Normal. Vanessa folded her arms. "You never talk about the company anymore." Rhett almost smiled. The statement would have been ironic if it weren't so serious. For years, she had dismissed every conversation about the company. Now, she wanted details. The timing wasn't difficult to notice. "What do you want to know?" he asked. Vanessa hesitated, then chose her words carefully. "How much is the company actually worth?" There it was. Not curiosity. Valuation. The distinction mattered. Rhett considered the question. "Depends." "On what market conditions?" She frowned. "Ballpark." He glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the road. "I don't know." For the first time that evening, Vanessa appeared frustrated. "You have to know." "No. You're the owner." Private companies aren't valued every morning before breakfast. Silence returned. The conversation ended, but the question remained. When they reached home, Vanessa headed upstairs. Rhett stayed in the kitchen. The house felt unusually quiet. He poured a glass of water and stood near the window. Outside, rain had started again. The neighborhood was dark, peaceful. His phone vibrated. A text message, Daniel Price. Rhett opened it. Need to talk tomorrow. Found something connected to the expense records. Important. Rhett read the message twice, then slipped the phone into his pocket. The next morning, Daniel arrived before sunrise. The CFO carried a folder thicker than any previous one. Notebooks, printouts, financial reports, authorization logs. The expression on his face immediately told Rhett something had changed. This wasn't another questionable hotel charge. This wasn't another expense report. This was bigger. Daniel closed the office door behind him, then placed the folder on the desk. "What is it?" Rhett asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I found the connection." Rhett waited. "The same vendor keeps appearing." "Which vendor?" "Cascade Strategic Consulting." The name immediately sounded familiar. The company linked to multiple suspicious expenses. Daniel opened the folder, then turned several pages. The address appeared again. The payment records appeared again. Then a new document surfaced. Corporate registration information, ownership disclosures, business filings. Daniel tapped a highlighted section. Rhett leaned forward. Read the page. Then read it again. The room suddenly felt smaller. Because the consulting company wasn't owned by a marketing firm. It wasn't owned by an outside contractor. It wasn't owned by a business associate. According to state records, Cascade Strategic Consulting belonged to someone much closer. Someone who had never mentioned it. Someone who had been approving payments to it for more than a year. Vanessa Alexander. And for the first time since the investigation began, Rhett felt something colder than disappointment. Because hidden expenses were one thing. A hidden company receiving money from his company was something else entirely. Rhett Alexander did not confront Vanessa about Cascade Strategic Consulting. Not that day, not the next day, not even the following week. That surprised Daniel Price. It would have surprised most people. A hidden company receiving money from Alexander Ledger Systems sounded like the beginning of a dramatic confrontation. Arguments, accusations, demands. Instead, Rhett did something much less exciting. He called an attorney, specifically Charlotte Mercer. Charlotte had spent nearly 3 decades handling complex business litigation and high-asset divorce cases throughout Oregon. She had a reputation for one thing: preparation. The first meeting took place in her office overlooking downtown Portland. No raised voices, no emotional speeches, just documents. Boxes of them. Charlotte reviewed everything carefully. Expense records, authorization logs, corporate filings, vendor histories, ownership disclosures. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. When she finally closed the last folder, she leaned back in her chair. "What do you want to do?" Rhett answered immediately. "The truth." Charlotte smiled slightly. "Good answer." Then her expression became serious. "Because the truth is going to matter more than the money." She pointed toward the documents. "If these records are accurate, this isn't really about expense reports." "What is it about pattern?" Rhett nodded. He had reached the same conclusion. The dollar amount mattered. The behavior mattered more. Charlotte folded her hands. "Do you believe the marriage can be repaired?" The question lingered in the room. Outside, traffic moved slowly through the afternoon rain. Inside, Rhett remained silent. Not because he didn't know. Because he did. The answer had been growing clearer for years. Finally, he spoke. "I think it's already over." Charlotte didn't react. She had heard similar answers countless times. "What happens next?" Rhett looked toward the window. "I don't know." Unfortunately, events moved faster than either of them expected. 2 months later, Vanessa filed for divorce. The petition arrived on a Tuesday morning. A courier delivered it directly to Rhett's office. He was reviewing compliance updates when the envelope appeared on his desk. The legal documents were thick, professional, predictable. Nothing in them surprised him. The filing cited irreconcilable differences. No allegations, no scandals, no dramatic accusations, just the formal end of a marriage that had been fading for years. Rhett read the paperwork once, then placed it neatly back inside the envelope. His reaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Daniel watched from across the office. "Are you okay?" Rhett nodded. "Yes." Daniel didn't believe him, but he also knew better than to push. The divorce process began quietly. At first, asset disclosures, financial statements, property inventories, routine legal procedures, the kind that happen every day in courtrooms across America. Charlotte handled most of it. Rhett continued running the company. The Northwest Health Alliance negotiations remained active. Employees remained focused. Clients remained satisfied. Business continued. Until the first settlement proposal arrived. That changed everything. Charlotte called immediately. "You should come in." The tone of her voice told Rhett enough. Something unusual had happened. An hour later, he sat across from her conference table. The proposal rested between them. Several pages, multiple requests, property divisions, investment allocations, support provisions, standard legal language. Then Charlotte turned to one specific page. "Read this." Rhett did. Twice, then a third time. Not because he misunderstood, because the request seemed absurd. Charlotte watched quietly. Finally, Rhett looked up. "She's serious." Apparently. The proposal contained a specific demand. Vanessa wanted exclusive ownership of Alexander Ledger Systems. 100%. Not partial ownership. Not compensation based on value. Not a negotiated equity distribution. Complete ownership. The entire company. Everything. Rhett sat back slowly. For several seconds he said nothing. Charlotte waited. Finally she spoke. "I've seen ambitious settlement demands before. This feels different." "It is." The attorney slid another document across the table. "Here's the interesting part." Rhett read. The filing wasn't merely requesting company value. It requested operational ownership, control, authority, responsibility. All of it. Charlotte shook her head. "I don't think she understands what she's asking for." That observation proved important, because Alexander Ledger Systems wasn't a vacation home. It wasn't an investment account. It wasn't a luxury asset. It was a functioning healthcare technology company. A complicated one. The business handled protected medical information, compliance obligations, federal reporting requirements, security audits, contractual liabilities, insurance requirements, operational risks. Owning it meant accepting everything attached to it. Not just the revenue. Charlotte pointed toward a stack of corporate records. "You built a machine," Rhett nodded. "And machines come with maintenance." Exactly. Several days later, the first formal settlement meeting took place. The conference room occupied an upper floor in a downtown Portland law office, neutral territory. Large windows, gray carpet, polished wood table. Everyone arrived on time. Charlotte sat beside Rhett. Across from them sat Vanessa and her attorney, Gregory Whitman. Rhett had heard of Gregory before, highly respected, experienced, methodical, not known for theatrics. The meeting began professionally. Introductions, procedural discussions, general framework. Then Gregory presented Vanessa's proposal. Charlotte remained expressionless. Rhett remained calm. Vanessa appeared confident, very confident. The demand appeared again. Exclusive ownership of Alexander Ledger Systems. Gregory reviewed it as if discussing ordinary property. The room stayed quiet. Charlotte finally spoke. To clarify, your client is requesting full operational ownership, correct? Not valuation. No. Ownership. Correct. Charlotte made a note. Then another, then another. Gregory continued. Vanessa wanted the company transferred entirely as part of the final settlement structure. The request hung in the room. Heavy, unusual, potentially catastrophic. Rhett watched Gregory carefully. Something seemed off. Not wrong, just incomplete. Almost as though Gregory hadn't yet reviewed the full implications. Charlotte apparently sensed the same thing. Has your client reviewed the corporate disclosures? She asked. Gregory nodded. The preliminary disclosures. Charlotte's pen stopped moving. Only the preliminary package. At this stage, yes. For the first time, Rhett noticed a subtle change in Charlotte's expression. Not concern. Anticipation. The distinction mattered, because preliminary disclosures contained only a fraction of the company's complexity. The real disclosures were much larger, much more detailed, much more dangerous. Charlotte closed her folder, then spoke carefully. We'll provide the complete corporate package. Gregory nodded. Thank you. Vanessa looked pleased, perhaps even relieved, as though victory had already begun. Rhett noticed that too, not because he cared about winning, because confidence often reveals assumptions, and assumptions can be expensive. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Everyone stood. Handshakes followed, professional courtesy remained intact. But something had shifted. As Charlotte gathered her files, Gregory approached. How extensive is the disclosure package? Charlotte smiled. Very. The answer seemed harmless, yet Rhett noticed Gregory's expression. A brief hesitation, a tiny flicker of uncertainty, almost invisible, but present. The following week, Charlotte assembled the full disclosure package. The stack exceeded several inches in height. Contracts, compliance obligations, insurance documents, vendor agreements, audit requirements, federal reporting standards, security certifications, licensing records, operational liabilities. Thousands of pages. The true anatomy of the company. When Rhett saw the completed package, even he felt impressed. Not by the size, by the responsibility. Every page represented years of work, years of risk, years of decisions. The documents were delivered to Gregory's office 2 days later. Then, everyone waited. 3 days passed. Nothing. 4 days. Still nothing. On the 5th day, Charlotte received a phone call. Gregory Whitman. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. Charlotte listened more than she spoke. When it ended, she placed the phone down slowly. Rhett sat across from her office. What happened? Charlotte allowed herself a small smile. The attorney finally started reading. Rhett understood immediately. Gregory had now seen the real company, not the image, not the revenue, not the rumors, the reality. And somewhere inside, thousands of pages of obligations, liabilities, certifications, and legal responsibilities. An experienced attorney had apparently discovered something that made him pause, something significant enough that he wanted another meeting, as soon as possible. The second settlement meeting took place 10 days later. This time the atmosphere felt different before anyone spoke. Rhett Alexander noticed it immediately. Experienced negotiators often revealed themselves through small details, how they entered a room, where they placed their files, how quickly they spoke, how often they made eye contact. Gregory Whitman had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. At the first meeting he carried confidence. At this meeting he carried caution. The distinction mattered. Charlotte Mercer noticed it too. Neither attorney commented. They simply sat down. The conference room overlooked downtown Portland. Gray clouds covered the city. Rain streaked the windows. A fitting backdrop for a discussion nobody seemed eager to begin. Gregory opened several folders, then paused. For a brief moment he looked less like an advocate and more like a man solving a difficult puzzle. Vanessa sat beside him. Perfect posture, perfect appearance, perfect confidence. She seemed completely unaware of the shift. Rhett watched quietly. As always, the meeting began with routine matters, property disclosures, investment accounts, retirement assets, real estate evaluations. Nothing unusual. Then Charlotte leaned forward. "Have you completed your review of the corporate disclosures?" Gregory exhaled slowly. "Yes." That single word carried far more weight than it appeared. Charlotte nodded. "And?" Gregory glanced toward Vanessa, then back toward Charlotte. "The company is considerably more complex than initially represented." Vanessa frowned. "What does that mean?" Gregory answered carefully. "It means ownership carries substantial obligations." The room grew quiet. Vanessa crossed her arms. "Every business has obligations." "Yes." "And—" Gregory reached for one of the disclosure binders. The thick volume landed on the table with a noticeable thud. "This is not a retail store." No one spoke. Gregory opened the binder. Several tabs divided the contents. Compliance, federal reporting, cybersecurity, insurance, licensing, vendor contracts, data security, audit requirements. The sections seemed endless. Rhett had spent years living inside those documents. Vanessa appeared to be seeing them for the first time. Gregory turned several pages, then pointed. "Alexander Ledger Systems Processes Protected Healthcare Information." Vanessa nodded impatiently. "I know that." "I don't think you do." The response surprised everyone, including Charlotte. Gregory continued. "This company operates within a highly regulated environment." More pages turned. "The ownership structure includes direct responsibility for compliance oversight." Another page. "Annual audit obligations." Another. "Cybersecurity certification reviews." Another. "Potential breach liability." Another. "Federal reporting requirements." The stack seemed to grow larger with every explanation. Vanessa's confidence began showing its first cracks. Not fear. Confusion. The kind that appears when reality doesn't match assumptions. Gregory continued. "If you own the company, you own all of this." His hand rested on the binder. Thousands of pages, thousands of obligations, years of accumulated responsibility. Rhett remained silent. Because Gregory was explaining exactly what Rhett had expected someone would eventually explain. Ownership was not a prize. Ownership was responsibility. The revenue existed because the responsibility existed. One could not be separated from the other. Vanessa shifted in her chair. "So, hire people." Gregory blinked. "I'm sorry. People handle those things." Charlotte looked down to hide a brief smile. Gregory remained professional. "Some responsibilities can be delegated." "Exactly. But legal accountability cannot." Silence followed. The statement landed heavily, because it was true, and truth often sounded inconvenient. Gregory opened another section. This one involved healthcare compliance certifications. Certain contracts require designated oversight personnel. He pointed toward specific language. "Mr. Alexander currently holds those certifications." Vanessa looked unimpressed. "So," Gregory looked directly at her, "so, ownership without operational capability creates risk." For the first time, Vanessa appeared irritated. Not with Rhett. With Gregory. Rhett noticed that immediately. It wasn't difficult. Her expression hardened. The conversation was no longer moving where she expected. The meeting continued for another hour. Every section revealed another layer. Liability insurance requirements, data security obligations, vendor guarantees, service level agreements, federal privacy regulations. None of it sounded glamorous, because it wasn't. It was work, complex work, expensive work, necessary work, the exact work Rhett had spent over a decade building systems around. By the end of the discussion, several binders sat open across the table. The company looked less like an asset and more like an ecosystem, a complicated machine requiring constant attention. Gregory finally closed the last binder, then rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture Rhett hadn't seen before. The attorney looked tired, not physically, professionally, the way people look when they discover a situation is much more complicated than expected. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Everyone stood. Chairs moved, folders closed. But before anyone left, Gregory spoke. "Ms. Alexander, may I have a word?" Vanessa frowned. "Now, yes." The answer came immediately. Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't optional. Vanessa reluctantly agreed. The two stepped into the hallway. The conference room door closed behind them. Charlotte gathered her notes. Rhett remained seated. Neither spoke. Outside the glass walls, people moved through the office corridor. Rain continued falling beyond the windows. 5 minutes passed, then 7, then 10. Charlotte finally glanced toward the hallway. "They're taking longer than expected." Rhett nodded. That was all, because he already knew what was happening. Gregory was doing his job. Nothing more. Nothing less. Experienced attorneys dislike surprises, and Alexander Ledger Systems had delivered several. The door eventually opened. Vanessa returned first. Her expression was different. Not defeated, not frightened, angry. A very specific kind of anger. The kind produced when someone receives advice they don't want to hear. Gregory entered behind her. His face revealed nothing. Years of courtroom experience had taught him how to hide reactions. But Rhett noticed one thing. The attorney no longer looked comfortable with the settlement demand. The meeting ended minutes later. No agreements, no resolutions, no progress. Everyone departed. Yet the hallway conversation lingered, especially in Rhett's mind, because he had observed enough negotiations to recognize a turning point. Something had happened out there. Something important. The answer arrived later that evening. Charlotte called. "I heard from Gregory." Rhett listened. "He asked whether we'd consider alternative settlement structures." That was interesting, very interesting. "What changed?" Charlotte laughed softly. "He finally understands the company." Rhett leaned back in his chair. The office was nearly empty. Outside, Portland traffic moved beneath streetlights. Inside, the silence felt peaceful. "What exactly did he say?" Charlotte paused, then answered. "Unofficially, sure. He told your wife she may want to reconsider." The words hung in the air. Simple, direct, powerful. Rhett wasn't surprised, because anyone who truly understood the company would eventually reach the same conclusion. Owning Alexander Ledger Systems wasn't like owning a luxury home. It wasn't like owning stock. It wasn't even like owning a successful business in the traditional sense. It meant carrying legal responsibility for healthcare data systems serving hundreds of providers. Every security incident, every audit, every compliance review, every contractual obligation, everything. For years, Vanessa had seen only the visible side. Revenue, growth, reputation. Now someone had finally shown her the invisible side, and apparently she didn't like it. The next morning brought another development. A social media post. Nothing overt, nothing that mentioned Rhett by name. Just a carefully worded message about betrayal. Trust, starting over. Several mutual friends immediately responded. Supportive comments, encouragement, speculation. The post spread quickly. Rhett saw it, read it once, then closed the screen. He had no interest in public arguments, no interest in defending himself online, no interest in competing for sympathy. Charlotte approved. Good. Rhett looked up from his desk. Good. The person with evidence should never race the person with opinions. He almost smiled. That sounded exactly like something she would say. The day continued. Meetings, client calls, operational reviews. Business remained business. Until late afternoon. His phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. Nathan Cole, Northwest Health Alliance. Rhett answered immediately. Nathan. The executive sounded polite, professional, but concerned. We need to talk. Rhett felt a subtle tightening in his chest. Not fear. Awareness. Important conversations often began that way. Nathan continued. Some rumors are circulating. The office suddenly seemed much quieter. Rhett turned toward the window. Below Portland moved normally. Cars, pedestrians, rain, life. Yet somewhere beyond the glass, the divorce was beginning to escape the private world of lawyers and paperwork. And once that happened, consequences could reach much further than a courtroom. Nathan's next words made that possibility impossible to ignore. We've been asked whether your company is stable. We've been asked whether your company is stable. Nathan Cole's words lingered in the silence. Rhett Alexander remained standing beside the window of his office. The Portland skyline blurred behind sheets of rain. His grip on the phone tightened slightly, not because he was angry, because he understood exactly what the question meant. In healthcare technology, perception mattered. Trust mattered. Stability mattered. Clients entrusted companies like Alexander Ledger Systems with sensitive information payment systems, compliance infrastructure, and operational continuity. The software didn't simply process transactions. It supported businesses that cared for patients. Any uncertainty created risk. Nathan continued, I wanted to hear it directly from you. Rhett appreciated that. Many executives wouldn't have made the call. They would have listened to rumors, speculated privately, made decisions quietly. Nathan preferred facts. That was one reason Rhett respected him. The company is stable, Rhett said. Any ownership disputes not operationally. Any risk to service delivery has no. Compliance concerns, no. Nathan paused, then exhaled. That's what I thought. The tension eased slightly, not completely, but enough. The executive lowered his voice. The rumors are getting specific. That caught Rhett's attention. Specific how? Nathan hesitated. As if someone is intentionally shaping the narrative. The statement landed heavily, because Rhett had already suspected as much. Social media posts, private conversations, carefully worded comments, nothing direct, nothing actionable, just enough to encourage assumptions. Nathan continued. Someone suggested the company may be changing ownership. Rhett looked out across the city. Traffic crawled through the rain below. No. That's what I told them. Another pause. Then Nathan laughed softly. You know what's funny? What? The people spreading rumors never seem to understand how the company actually works. For the first time that day, Rhett smiled. A small one, barely visible. Nathan had accidentally identified the core problem. Most people saw only revenue. Very few saw responsibility. After the call ended, Rhett sat quietly for several minutes, thinking, observing, connecting pieces. The rumors weren't random. Someone wanted others to believe Alexander Ledger Systems was vulnerable. perhaps unstable, perhaps available, perhaps easier to claim. The timing aligned too perfectly with the divorce. That didn't make it proof, but it made it difficult to ignore. Later that afternoon, Charlotte Mercer arrived at the office. She carried a thin folder. Compared to the mountains of legal documents already accumulated, it seemed insignificant. It wasn't. She placed it on Rhett's desk. "What is it?" "Public activity." Rhett opened the folder. Screenshots, posts, comments, messages, nothing dramatic. That was what made them effective. Each post remained technically harmless. Individually, collectively, they painted a picture. A struggling marriage, an absent husband, a disconnected business owner, a woman rebuilding her life. Charlotte sat across from him. "Notice what's missing." Rhett reviewed several pages, then understood. "The company." Exactly. The company was never directly mentioned, yet somehow every conversation drifted toward it, toward ownership, toward finances, toward future control. The implications remained carefully hidden beneath layers of suggestion. Charlotte folded her arms. "Smart?" Rhett nodded. "Very." The attorney leaned back. "Unfortunately for her, implication isn't evidence." That sentence perfectly summarized Charlotte's philosophy. Facts, records, documents, not assumptions, not feelings, not public sympathy. The law cared about evidence, nothing else. 2 days later, another settlement meeting took place. This one felt noticeably different. Gregory Whitman entered, carrying far fewer documents. Vanessa entered, carrying far more frustration. The contrast was obvious. The conference room atmosphere turned tense almost immediately. Charlotte noticed. Rhett noticed. Gregory certainly noticed. Vanessa began speaking before everyone had fully settled. "I don't understand why we're making this so complicated." Nobody answered. She continued. "The company should be part of the settlement." Charlotte nodded calmly. "It is." "Then transfer it." The room became quiet. Gregory lowered his eyes briefly. Rhett saw it. A tiny reaction, yet revealing. Vanessa looked toward her attorney, expecting support. Instead, Gregory spoke carefully. "I think we need to revisit the ownership request." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Vanessa turned slowly toward him. "What?" Gregory remained composed. "The request deserves further analysis." "No." The answer came instantly, emotionally, unexpectedly. Gregory maintained his professional tone. "The obligations attached to ownership create significant exposure." Vanessa stared at him. "As opposed to what letting him keep everything." Charlotte said nothing. Rhett said nothing. The discussion was no longer theirs. Gregory adjusted his glasses. "No one is suggesting that." "Then what are you suggesting?" The attorney chose his words with visible care. "I'm suggesting that complete ownership may not be in your best interest." The sentence changed everything. Not legally, emotionally. Because for the first time, someone on Vanessa's side was advising caution. The reaction was immediate. Disbelief, frustration, suspicion. Rhett recognized all three. Vanessa leaned forward. "You sound like you're representing him." "No. I'm asking for what's fair." Gregory remained calm. "And I'm explaining risk." The distinction mattered. One person discussed desire, the other discussed reality. The conversation deteriorated from there. Not dramatically, just steadily. Every explanation Gregory offered seemed to increase Vanessa's irritation. Every warning sounded like resistance. Every concern sounded like opposition. The meeting ended without progress. Again. Afterward, Gregory requested a private conversation in the hallway. Again. The pattern repeated. Charlotte remained inside the conference room organizing documents. Rhett sat quietly beside her. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Charlotte glanced toward the closed door. "She's not listening." Rhett nodded. "No." The attorney looked thoughtful. "That can become dangerous." Rhett understood. Not dangerous physically, dangerous strategically. People who ignore inconvenient facts often make expensive decisions. 10 minutes later, Gregory returned alone. Vanessa had already left. That was unusual. The attorney appeared exhausted, years older than when the process began. Charlotte stood. "Everything all right?" Gregory managed a tired smile. "No." The honesty surprised everyone, including himself. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Gregory turned toward Rhett. The attorney's expression became professional again, measured, controlled, yet something beneath it remained visible. Concern. Not for the divorce, for the consequences. Finally, Gregory spoke. "I've advised my client to reconsider." Rhett said nothing. The statement required no response. Gregory continued. "Repeatedly." Charlotte crossed her arms. "And," the attorney shook his head, "she believes there's something we're missing." Rhett almost laughed, not because the situation was amusing, because he knew exactly what Vanessa believed. Some hidden account, some concealed asset, some secret fortune, a dramatic revelation waiting behind the curtain. Gregory seemed to reach the same conclusion. "The problem," he said quietly, "is that every time I look deeper, I find more responsibility instead of more money." Charlotte smiled. "Welcome to business ownership." For the first time all afternoon, Gregory actually laughed. A short one, humorless, accurate. The conversation ended shortly afterward, yet one detail stayed with Rhett. As Gregory gathered his files, the attorney paused, just briefly, then spoke. "Most people have no idea what they own." Charlotte looked curious. "What do you mean?" Gregory glanced toward the binders. "Your client does." The comment wasn't really directed at Charlotte or Rhett. It was an observation, one professional recognizing another, because throughout the entire process, Rhett had never exaggerated, never hidden, never dramatized. He simply documented, prepared, maintained records. The same habits that built the company were now protecting it. 3 days later, another development arrived. This one came through official channels. A deposition date. The formal examination under oath had been scheduled. Documents would be reviewed, statements recorded, evidence preserved, questions answered. Everything would move into a far more serious phase. Charlotte reviewed the notice, then handed it to Rhett. "This is where stories start running into records." Rhett read the date. 2 weeks away. Not much time. Not enough for surprises. More than enough for preparation. Outside the office, rain continued falling across Portland. Inside, the company moved forward. Employees worked. Clients called. Contracts advanced. Business continued, including the Northwest Health Alliance negotiations. Especially those negotiations. Because while the divorce consumed attention, another reality remained unchanged. The company was still growing, still expanding, still becoming more valuable. And somewhere between the growing business, the legal filings, the expense records, and the mounting frustration, a collision was approaching. One that would take place under oath, where every statement would matter, and where evidence would finally begin speaking for itself. The deposition took place on a rainy Wednesday morning. Portland seemed determined to provide the appropriate atmosphere. Gray skies, wet streets, cold wind. The offices of Whitman and Associates occupied the 12th floor of a modern glass building downtown. By 9 o'clock, everyone had arrived. Attorneys, court reporter, legal assistants, Stacks of documents, boxes of exhibits, enough paperwork to fill an entire wall. Red Alexander sat quietly near the end of the conference table. Dark jacket, light blue shirt, no expensive accessories, no visible reaction. Across from him sat Vanessa, confident, composed, prepared, at least outwardly. Gregory Whitman reviewed several pages before the proceedings began. Charlotte Mercer organized her notes. The court reporter adjusted recording equipment. Then the deposition officially started. Formal instructions came first. Oaths, procedures, clarifications, the usual legal framework. Once completed, Gregory began questioning his own client. A common practice? Establishing background information, employment history, marriage timeline, financial contributions. Nothing unusual. For nearly an hour, the discussion remained predictable. Then, Gregory arrived at the company. Alexander Ledger Systems. The room subtly changed. Everyone felt it. Even the court reporter seemed more attentive. Gregory spoke calmly. "Mrs. Alexander, please describe your role in the company." Vanessa answered without hesitation. "I helped build it." Charlotte made a note. Nothing else. Gregory continued. "What do you mean by helped build it?" "I supported Rhett throughout the growth process." A reasonable answer, technically. Then Gregory asked another question. "Did you participate in management?" "Yes." Charlotte wrote another note. Still nothing. The questioning continued. Vanessa described herself as an active contributor, a strategic advisor, a participant in major business decisions, someone whose influence extended behind the scenes. Rhett listened quietly, not because he agreed, because he had expected it. People often remember events differently when money becomes involved. Memory becomes flexible. Records don't. After another 20 minutes, Gregory concluded his examination. Then Charlotte began. The difference appeared immediately. Gregory had explored perceptions. Charlotte explored evidence. She opened a binder, the first of many. "Mrs. Alexander, were you ever employed by Alexander Ledger Systems?" Vanessa paused. "No." "Did you receive a salary?" "No." "Benefits?" "No." "Executive compensation?" "No." Charlotte nodded. Simple, methodical. The questions continued. "Did you attend board meetings?" "Sometimes." Charlotte opened another binder. "Can you identify which meetings?" Vanessa hesitated. The pause lasted only a second, but it mattered. "I don't remember." Charlotte slid several documents across the table. Board attendance records, official minutes, sign-in logs, every meeting, every attendee, every year. The records were clear. Vanessa appeared at none of them, not one. Gregory studied the pages silently. Charlotte continued. "Were you a corporate officer?" "No." "Director?" "No." "Shareholder?" "No." "Authorized signatory?" "No." Another pause. Another answer. Another fact. Charlotte remained calm. Never aggressive, never dramatic. Just precise. The questions kept coming, each supported by documentation, payroll records, corporate filings, organizational charts, executive directories, audit certifications, compliance records. Every document told the same story. Rhett built and operated the company. Vanessa did not. The distinction became increasingly difficult to ignore. Then, Charlotte shifted direction. The atmosphere changed immediately. She opened a new binder, smaller, thinner, more focused. Expense records. Rhett recognized it instantly. So did Gregory. Vanessa didn't. Not yet. "Mrs. Alexander, are you familiar with Cascade Strategic Consulting?" The question sounded harmless. Vanessa answered quickly. "Yes," Charlotte nodded. "What is it, this consulting business? Owned by whom?" Vanessa hesitated, then answered, "Me." The room became noticeably quieter. Even the court reporter glanced up briefly. Charlotte continued, "When was the company formed?" Vanessa provided the date. Charlotte already knew it. Everyone knew it. Because every answer existed in written records. The attorney opened another folder. "Did Cascade Strategic Consulting provide services to Alexander Ledger Systems?" "Yes." "What services?" "Just marketing." Charlotte waited, then asked the obvious follow-up. "What marketing?" The pause lasted longer this time. Not dramatic, just uncomfortable. Vanessa eventually answered, "General business consulting." Charlotte made another note, then another, then another. The questions continued. "What reports were generated?" "I don't remember." "What deliverables were produced?" "I don't know." "What measurable outcomes resulted?" Silence. Charlotte turned a page, then another, then another. The pattern was becoming visible, not because Charlotte accused anyone of wrongdoing, because documentation kept failing to appear. Eventually, Gregory intervened. "Let's move on." Charlotte smiled slightly. "Certainly," which surprised everyone, because she seemed perfectly willing to move on. At least for now. The deposition continued through lunch. Hours passed. Records accumulated. Statements accumulated. Inconsistencies accumulated. By mid-afternoon, Vanessa appeared increasingly frustrated. Not because Charlotte raised her voice, because she never did. The attorney simply possessed something stronger than emotion. Documentation. Every answer encountered supporting records, or conflicting records. Nothing remained abstract. Everything became verifiable. Then, Charlotte reached a subject that changed the entire day. System access, corporate platforms, administrative permissions. She opened another exhibit. This one involved digital activity logs, thousands of entries, timestamps, IP addresses, login histories, every interaction preserved automatically by company systems. Charlotte slid the report forward. "Mrs. Alexander, did you access company financial portals?" "Sometimes." "How often?" "I don't know." Charlotte nodded, then highlighted specific entries. Dates, times, locations, repeated access to valuation reports, ownership documents, executive compensation files, corporate structure records. The activity concentrated within a specific period, just before the divorce filing. The timing looked difficult to explain. Gregory noticed, Rhett noticed. Charlotte certainly noticed. Vanessa shifted in her chair. For the first time that day, uncertainty became visible, not because of a single document, because of accumulation. One record alone meant little. Hundreds created patterns, and patterns tell stories. Charlotte finally closed the binder, then looked toward Gregory. "I'm done for now." The statement sounded ordinary, yet everyone understood its significance. The deposition wasn't ending because Charlotte lacked questions. It was ending because she had already established something important. A foundation, a record, a timeline. Gregory requested a short break. The court reporter agreed. People stood. Coffee appeared. Water bottles opened. Conversations remained muted. Rhett moved toward a window overlooking downtown Portland. The rain hadn't stopped. Neither had the legal process. Behind him, Gregory spoke quietly with Vanessa. Their conversation appeared tense, not hostile, concerned. Several times Gregory pointed toward documents. Several times Vanessa shook her head. Rhett looked away. The details didn't matter. The evidence did. A few minutes later, Charlotte approached, holding a small silver flash drive. Rhett recognized it immediately. The USB, one of the final pieces. Not the strongest evidence, not the most dramatic, but potentially the most revealing. Charlotte held it carefully. "We may need this," Rhett looked at the device. Months earlier, it had seemed insignificant. Just another archived file. Now it felt different. important, potentially decisive. "What's on it?" Gregory asked from across the room. Charlotte turned. A small smile appeared. "Something I hope we won't need." The answer was technically true, because the contents only mattered if certain statements remained unchanged. Gregory studied the flash drive, then looked back toward Vanessa. For the first time all day, the veteran attorney appeared genuinely worried. Not about the deposition, about what might come next. And judging by the way Charlotte carefully returned the USB to her briefcase, she knew exactly why. The USB drive sat inside Charlotte Mercer's briefcase for another 11 days. Nobody mentioned it. Not Gregory Whitman, not Vanessa, not even Rhett Alexander. That was intentional. Evidence had timing. Charlotte understood that better than most attorneys. The strongest evidence wasn't always the most dramatic. Sometimes, it was the evidence introduced at exactly the right moment. And according to Charlotte, that moment hadn't arrived yet. The period between the deposition and the next settlement conference became unusually quiet, at least on the surface. Behind the scenes, however, tensions continued building. Additional documents were exchanged. Financial disclosures expanded. Valuation experts reviewed records. Attorneys prepared arguments. Meanwhile, Alexander Ledger Systems continued operating. Clients called. Employees worked. Software updates shipped. Compliance audits continued. Life moved forward. That mattered to Rhett, because it reminded him of something important. The company existed independently of the divorce. It wasn't merely an asset. It wasn't merely a legal dispute. Hundreds of clinics relied on it. Thousands of healthcare workers interacted with it. Millions of transactions flowed through it every month. The business had become larger than the conflict surrounding it. One Tuesday morning, Nathan Cole called again. This time the conversation felt different, more relaxed. "The rumors are dying down." Rhett appreciated hearing that. "Good," Nathan laughed. "Turns out stable companies keep looking stable." That was one advantage of reality. Eventually, it becomes difficult to argue against. Several major clients had independently reviewed Alexander Ledger Systems. Nothing appeared unusual. No interruptions. No operational concerns. No instability. Business performance continued speaking louder than speculation. After the call ended, Rhett returned to reviewing software security reports. The morning passed quietly, until Charlotte arrived. She carried the same briefcase, the same calm expression, the same silver USB drive. This time she placed it directly on the desk. "We need to talk." Rhett looked at the device, then at her. About timing." Charlotte sat down. The attorney rarely wasted words, which meant the conversation mattered. She folded her hands. "Vanessa's position hasn't changed." "No. Neither has Gregory's." Rhett nodded. That much was obvious. Gregory increasingly understood the risks. Vanessa increasingly ignored them. The gap between those positions was becoming impossible to miss. Charlotte slid a folder across the desk. Inside were excerpts from the deposition transcript. Highlighted sections, specific statements, specific claims, specific denials. Rhett reviewed several pages, then understood. Vanessa had continued describing herself as actively involved in company operations, strategic decisions, business oversight, financial participation. The narrative remained consistent. Unfortunately for her, certain records suggested otherwise. Charlotte tapped the transcript. "These statements create a problem. For Hergy, for everyone." The attorney leaned back. "If a story becomes too disconnected from documentation, eventually the documentation wins." Rhett looked toward the USB. "And that's where this comes in." Charlotte nodded. "Potentially." The flash drive contained archived internal meeting recordings. Nothing secret. Nothing illegally obtained. Routine business records. Years old. Stored automatically during remote operations. Most had never been reviewed after being archived. until Daniel Price accidentally rediscovered one. A particular meeting, a particular conversation, a particular moment, one that became increasingly relevant after the deposition. Charlotte opened another file. The transcript summary appeared, several pages long, specific timestamps highlighted, specific statements identified. The recording involved Vanessa, Daniel, and a small group of administrative personnel. The discussion centered around expense classifications, nothing extraordinary. At first, then the conversation changed. One request, one suggestion, one seemingly minor instruction. Yet that instruction directly contradicted portions of Vanessa's later testimony. Charlotte closed the folder. We still don't have to use it. Rhett appreciated that, because contrary to what many people assumed, he didn't want public humiliation. He didn't want revenge. He wanted accuracy. Nothing more, nothing less. Unfortunately, accuracy sometimes requires uncomfortable evidence. The next settlement conference took place 3 days later. Everyone appeared tired. Months of legal proceedings produced that effect. Even Gregory looked exhausted. The conference room atmosphere felt heavy, less combative, more resigned. Charlotte arrived with multiple binders. Rhett carried a single notebook. Vanessa entered wearing the same confidence she had displayed from the beginning. Yet something underneath had changed. Rhett could see it. Pressure. The accumulated weight of facts. The meeting began with updated settlement proposals, property allocations, investment adjustments, cash distributions. Several minor issues moved toward resolution. Then the discussion returned to the company, as it always did. Vanessa's position remained unchanged. She still wanted ownership, complete ownership. Charlotte reviewed the request, then looked toward Gregory. The attorney seemed uncomfortable. Again. That pattern was becoming familiar. Eventually, Gregory cleared his throat. My client believes the company has been intentionally undervalued. The statement surprised nobody, not even Charlotte. She opened a binder. Based on what? Gregory glanced toward Vanessa, then answered carefully. She believes relevant information may not have been disclosed. The room became very quiet. Because that wasn't a casual accusation, Charlotte's expression never changed. Neither did Rhett's. But both understood the significance. The attorney slowly opened another folder. Everything has been disclosed. Vanessa immediately disagreed. No. Charlotte looked at her. For example, Vanessa hesitated, then answered, the company is worth more than he's admitting. The statement sounded confident. Unfortunately, confidence wasn't evidence. Charlotte asked another question. What specifically are we missing? Silence, not long, just enough. The answer never arrived, because no supporting documentation existed. Gregory knew it. Charlotte knew it. Rhett knew it. Yet the allegation remained. The discussion continued. The same arguments repeated. The same assumptions resurfaced. The same evidence contradicted them. Eventually, Charlotte closed her binder, then looked directly at Gregory. I think we're reaching a point where clarification becomes necessary. Gregory's expression tightened immediately. He understood. The attorney glanced toward the briefcase beside Charlotte's chair, then back toward her. What clarification? Charlotte reached inside and removed the USB drive. The movement seemed almost insignificant. A small piece of metal and plastic. Nothing more. Yet the reaction around the table was immediate. Gregory recognized it. Rhett recognized it. Vanessa didn't. Not yet. Charlotte placed the device carefully on the table, then spoke. We have additional records. The room remained silent. Gregory looked toward the USB, then toward Charlotte. What records? The attorney's answer arrived calmly. Archived internal meeting recordings. Vanessa frowned. So, Charlotte opened a document. Several pages of transcript excerpts, highlighted passages, highlighted timestamps. She slid them across the table. Gregory began reading. The change happened gradually. His eyes moved down the page, then back up, then down again. The attorney read the same section twice, then a third time. His expression slowly lost color. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for everyone to notice. Enough for Rhett to remember the opening settlement meeting months earlier. The same subtle reaction. The same realization. The same uncomfortable discovery. Gregory lowered the pages. What exactly is on the recording? Charlotte answered honestly. A conversation. About expense classifications. Nobody spoke. The attorney looked toward Vanessa, then back toward the transcript, then back toward Vanessa again. Something was becoming very clear. Painfully clear. The recording itself wasn't devastating. The problem was timing, specifically how the conversation compared to sworn testimony. Gregory finally stood. The movement surprised everyone, including Charlotte. "I'd like a recess." Charlotte nodded immediately. "Of course." The attorney gathered the transcript pages, then looked toward Vanessa. "We need to talk." His tone left no room for discussion. No debate, no negotiation, just necessity. Vanessa appeared confused, annoyed, defensive, but she followed him. The conference room door closed behind them. Silence filled the space. Several long seconds passed. Then Charlotte quietly returned the USB drive to her briefcase. Rhett watched. The office beyond the conference room continued functioning normally. Phones rang. Printers worked. People walked past. Life continued. Yet somewhere in the hallway, Gregory Whitman was reviewing evidence that threatened to change the entire direction of the case. And judging by the look on his face when he left the room, the attorney had already reached one uncomfortable conclusion. If the recording said what the transcript suggested it said, then continuing down the current path would become far more difficult than anyone expected. Courtroom 6B occupied the third floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. The room wasn't impressive. No marble columns, no dramatic architecture, no television cameras waiting outside. Just polished wood, neutral walls, rows of benches, a raised platform where Judge Eleanor Whitaker presided. The setting felt ordinary, which was fitting. Most life-changing decisions happen in ordinary rooms. The hearing began at 9 a.m. By 8:30, attorneys had already arrived. Charlotte Mercer organized her exhibits with military precision. Color-coded tabs, numbered binders, labeled folders. Every document had a place. Every place had a purpose. Across the aisle, Gregory Whitman appeared considerably less comfortable than he had months earlier. The veteran attorney remained professional, experienced, prepared. But Rhett Alexander noticed the difference. The confidence Gregory carried at the beginning of the case had gradually transformed into caution. Not because he was losing, because he understood the facts, and facts had a way of narrowing available arguments. Vanessa entered shortly before the hearing started. Her appearance drew attention immediately. Tailored navy suit, designer handbag, perfectly styled hair. Everything about her projected authority, success, control, the image of a powerful executive. Several people in the courtroom glanced her way. Rhett noticed that too. He also noticed something else. The image didn't match the records. That distinction would matter. Rhett himself looked exactly as he always did. Simple charcoal suit, no luxury accessories, no attempt to impress anyone. The contrast between them felt symbolic. One person focused on appearances, the other focused on documentation. Judge Eleanor Whitaker entered promptly at 9. The courtroom rose, then settled. The hearing began. Initial procedural matters consumed the first 30 minutes. Case status, pending issues, evidence schedules, nothing dramatic. Then Judge Whitaker turned to the central dispute: Alexander Ledger Systems. The room seemed to sharpen. Everyone became more attentive. The judge reviewed several documents, then looked toward Gregory. "Counselor, please summarize your client's position." Gregory stood. Professional, measured, careful. He outlined Vanessa's claim: contribution to the marriage, shared lifestyle, support provided throughout the company's growth, general principles of equitable distribution, nothing unusual, nothing inflammatory. Then came the critical point. His client continued seeking ownership of the company. The statement settled heavily across the courtroom. Judge Whitaker adjusted her glasses. "Full ownership." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge glanced at her notes, then at Vanessa, then back at Gregory. For several seconds, she said nothing. That silence felt significant. Finally, she spoke. "Has your client reviewed the complete corporate disclosures?" Gregory hesitated, only briefly. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded, then made another note. The hearing continued. Charlotte eventually stood. Her presentation differed immediately. Gregory focused on fairness. Charlotte focused on structure. She began describing the company, not emotionally, operationally. Healthcare software, protected data systems, regulatory obligations, compliance oversight, security certifications, vendor contracts, federal requirements. The judge listened carefully. Several pages of notes accumulated. Then Charlotte introduced something important. Not evidence, perspective. "Your Honor, ownership and value are not the same thing." The statement seemed simple, yet it captured the entire dispute. Many people assumed owning a company meant receiving money. Reality proved more complicated. Ownership also meant responsibility, liability, oversight, accountability. Charlotte explained each carefully. The judge nodded repeatedly. Vanessa remained expressionless, at least outwardly. Rhett watched quietly. The hearing wasn't about emotions anymore. Not really. The legal process had moved beyond feelings. It now revolved around facts. The distinction favored preparation, and Rhett had spent years preparing without realizing it. Charlotte eventually sat down. Judge Whitaker reviewed additional documents, then looked toward Vanessa. The courtroom grew silent. The judge rarely addressed parties directly. When she did, people paid attention. "Mrs. Alexander?" Vanessa straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge folded her hands. "I want to ensure you understand what you're requesting." The courtroom became very quiet. No movement, no whispers, nothing. Vanessa nodded confidently. "I do," Judge Whitaker continued. "You are seeking complete ownership of Alexander Ledger Systems." "Yes." "The company would become your responsibility." "Yes." The judge paused, then asked another question, one that seemed simple, yet carried enormous weight. "Can you explain your understanding of the operational obligations attached to that ownership?" For the first time all morning, Vanessa hesitated, only slightly, but enough for Rhett to notice. The answer eventually came. General references, broad descriptions, high-level observations, nothing specific, nothing detailed, nothing approaching the level of understanding demonstrated throughout the disclosures. Judge Whitaker listened patiently, then asked another question, this one more precise. What certifications would be required to maintain compliance oversight? Vanessa blinked. The answer didn't arrive, because she didn't know. The judge moved to another topic. Data security obligations, federal reporting requirements, contractual audit provisions, operational certifications. Each question revealed the same problem. Vanessa understood ownership conceptually, not operationally. The distinction grew increasingly visible. Gregory appeared uncomfortable. Charlotte remained calm. Rhett remained silent. Eventually, Judge Whittaker stopped asking questions. Several notes joined the growing stack before her. Then she turned toward Charlotte. "Counselor, does Mr. Alexander currently fulfill these responsibilities?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Personally?" "Yes." The answer mattered, because the company wasn't self-managing. It depended upon expertise, experience, knowledge accumulated over years, things that couldn't simply be transferred with a signature. Judge Whittaker nodded, then looked back toward Vanessa. Again, the courtroom became quiet. The judge spoke carefully, not critically, not emotionally, simply clearly. Owning a business and operating a business are not identical concepts. The statement landed heavily, because everyone understood who it was directed toward. Vanessa responded immediately. "I can hire people." Charlotte looked down. Gregory closed his eyes briefly. The judge remained composed. "To perform some functions, yes." "Exactly. But accountability remains with ownership." Silence followed. Again, the same issue, the same misunderstanding, the same reality. Throughout the hearing, Rhett noticed something interesting. Judge Whittaker never seemed impressed by revenue, or valuation, or status. She cared about function, responsibility, practical reality. That favored evidence, not appearances, and appearances had become increasingly important to Vanessa. The hearing paused for lunch shortly after noon. People filtered into hallways. Attorneys gathered documents. Court personnel moved between rooms. Rhett remained seated briefly before standing. Charlotte approached. "How are you holding up?" The question surprised him, not because she asked, because he hadn't considered it. He thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "Fine." Charlotte studied him. "You know, most people would be furious." Rhett looked toward the courtroom door. "No point." The attorney smiled slightly, exactly the response she expected. Outside, rain continued falling over Portland. Inside, the hearing would resume shortly. Yet something had already become clear. The dispute was no longer about who wanted the company. It was about who understood it. And that distinction was becoming harder to ignore with every question Judge Whittaker asked. As people gradually returned from lunch, Gregory Whitman sat quietly reviewing documents. More quietly than usual. The attorney seemed distracted, concerned, focused on something beyond the morning's testimony. Several times he reviewed the same pages. Several times he looked toward Vanessa, then toward a particular section of his binder. The behavior caught Rhett's attention, not because he knew what Gregory was thinking, because experienced attorneys rarely review the same documents repeatedly without reason. Something bothered him, something unresolved, something important. The afternoon session would begin in less than 15 minutes, and whatever Gregory had discovered appeared significant enough that he couldn't stop thinking about it. The afternoon session began at exactly 1:15 p.m. Judge Eleanor Whittaker returned to the bench. The attorneys returned to their tables. The courtroom settled into silence once again. Outside, rain continued falling across Portland. Inside, the focus narrowed toward a single issue. Evidence, not opinions, not assumptions, not stories. Evidence. Rhett Alexander sat quietly beside Charlotte Mercer. Throughout the lunch break, he had reviewed nothing, prepared nothing, changed nothing. There was no need. The documents already existed. The records already existed. The facts were already fixed. That was one advantage of truth. It didn't require rehearsal. Judge Whittaker opened the afternoon session by reviewing several exhibits submitted earlier in the case. Financial statements, corporate disclosures, compliance certifications, healthcare licensing records. One by one, the documents painted a picture, not of wealth, of responsibility. That distinction continued growing more important. Charlotte stood. Your Honor, we'd like to clarify several operational realities regarding Alexander Ledger Systems. The judge nodded. Proceed. Charlotte approached the lectern, then opened a thick binder, one of the largest introduced during the case. The front label read, Compliance and Regulatory Requirements. The title alone seemed exhausting. Charlotte began. Not dramatically, methodically, the way a teacher might explain a complicated subject to someone seeing it for the first time. She outlined the company's obligations, annual HIPAA compliance reviews, cybersecurity audits, federal privacy standards, healthcare data protection protocols, incident response requirements, third-party vendor assessments, contractual certifications, insurance obligations. The list continued, and continued, and continued. Every few minutes, Charlotte referenced another exhibit, another certification, another signed agreement, another regulatory requirement. Judge Whitaker took notes constantly. The stack beside her grew larger. Across the aisle, Vanessa's expression gradually changed, not because the information was shocking, because it was overwhelming. The company she wanted to own looked increasingly less like a valuable prize and increasingly more like a full-time responsibility. Charlotte eventually reached a particularly important section, Northwest Health Alliance. The room seemed to sharpen immediately. Everyone recognized the name, one of the largest healthcare networks in the Pacific Northwest. The contract itself remained confidential, but certain operational requirements could be discussed. Charlotte highlighted several: additional compliance obligations, additional reporting requirements, additional oversight responsibilities. The larger the contract became, the larger the burden became. That was the reality most outsiders never saw. Growth increased responsibility, not just profit. Judge Whitaker looked toward Charlotte. Who currently manages these obligations? Mr. Alexander. Personally, yes, Your Honor. The answer mattered, because it wasn't theoretical. Red actually performed those duties, not occasionally, continuously, year after year. Charlotte introduced another exhibit: professional certifications, training records, continuing education requirements, security oversight credentials. Every document carried Rhett's name. Judge Whitaker reviewed several pages, then looked toward Vanessa. Do you possess equivalent qualifications? The answer arrived softly. No. The judge nodded. No criticism, no reaction. Just another fact added to the record. The hearing continued. Charlotte introduced organizational charts next. Executive structures, reporting relationships, operational responsibilities. Again, the same pattern emerged. Red occupied critical roles throughout the system, not because he demanded control, because he built the company, because he understood the systems, because he maintained the relationships. The distinction mattered, especially now. Vanessa eventually attempted to redirect the discussion. The shift felt predictable. Facts had become uncomfortable. Emotion offered safer ground. She spoke about sacrifice, support, marriage, shared years, shared experiences. Some of her points were valid. Rhett knew that. Marriage always involves contributions that cannot be measured perfectly. Judge Whitaker acknowledged that reality. Yet each time the discussion drifted too far from evidence, the judge gently guided it back to documentation, back to records, back to practical realities. The pattern repeated several times. Eventually, even Vanessa seemed to recognize it. The courtroom simply wasn't interested in narratives unsupported by evidence. That realization appeared increasingly frustrating. Rhett noticed, because he remembered another version of Vanessa, years earlier, before appearances became so important, before status became a measuring tool. before every conversation seemed connected to perception. Those memories remained, even now, which made the situation sadder than most people realized. Not because of the divorce, because of the distance. The years lost between two versions of the same people. Judge Whittaker interrupted his thoughts. "Counselor, one question." Charlotte looked up. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge tapped several pages. If ownership were transferred tomorrow, what operational challenges would immediately exist? The question mattered a lot. Charlotte answered carefully. Several. She began listing them. Compliance authority transitions, contract approvals, certification gaps, regulatory notifications, vendor obligations, healthcare oversight requirements. The list continued. Judge Whittaker listened attentively, then asked another question. Could those responsibilities be assumed immediately by Mrs. Alexander? Charlotte paused. Not because she lacked an answer, because precision mattered. No, Your Honor. The courtroom became silent again. Judge Whittaker nodded slowly, then wrote something in her notes. Rhett couldn't see the words. He didn't need to. The significance was obvious. Ownership without capability created risk, and courts generally dislike creating unnecessary risk, particularly in healthcare, particularly when patient data and regulatory obligations are involved. The afternoon progressed steadily. Hours passed. Documents accumulated. Facts accumulated. Reality accumulated. Then something unexpected happened. Gregory Whitman stood, not because it was his turn, because he wanted permission to address the court. The request surprised everyone, including Vanessa. Judge Whittaker looked up. "Yes, Counselor." Gregory adjusted his glasses. For several seconds he seemed to choose his words carefully, more carefully than usual. Finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, I'd like a brief opportunity to confer with my client." The request immediately drew attention. Charlotte looked curious. Rhett looked toward Gregory. Vanessa looked confused. Judge Whittaker studied the attorney for a moment. "Regarding—" Gregory hesitated, then answered honestly. "Her requested remedy." The room grew noticeably quieter, because everyone understood what he meant. Ownership, the central issue, the very thing Vanessa had pursued from the beginning. Judge Whittaker granted the request. A brief recess followed. People stood. Attorneys gathered materials. Court staff moved quietly. Vanessa and Gregory walked toward a private consultation room adjacent to the courtroom. The door closed behind them. Charlotte remained at counsel table. A faint smile appeared. Not victory. Recognition. Something important was happening. Rhett sat beside her. Neither spoke immediately. Several minutes passed. Finally, Charlotte glanced toward the closed consultation room. "He knows." Rhett understood. Gregory had known for weeks, perhaps months. But now he knew something else. The court knew too. That changed everything. Evidence looks different when viewed privately. It looks even more powerful when viewed by a judge. The consultation lasted longer than expected. 10 minutes. 15. 20. When the door finally opened, Gregory emerged first. His expression looked exhausted. Professionally exhausted. The look of a man who had spent months explaining reality to someone determined not to hear it. Vanessa followed. Her face revealed something Rhett had not seen before. Not anger, not confidence, not frustration, uncertainty. For the first time since the divorce began. The afternoon session resumed shortly afterward. Yet Gregory's demeanor had changed, subtly, but unmistakably. The attorney no longer seemed interested in advancing the ownership argument. He seemed interested in limiting damage, and that distinction mattered. A lot. Because experienced attorneys only shift strategy when facts leave them no alternative. As the hearing approached its conclusion, Judge Whitaker reviewed several final exhibits, then paused. One particular document appeared to capture her attention, longer than the others. The judge read it carefully, twice, then placed it aside. Her expression remained neutral, but Rhett noticed Charlotte looking toward the same document, a specific exhibit, one that had remained sealed until now, one that very few people had discussed, one that dated back years before the divorce, years before the investigation, years before the lawsuit. And judging by the way both attorneys reacted, the contents of that exhibit might prove far more important than anyone initially realized. The sealed exhibit remained unopened until the following morning. That alone made it important. Courts deal with thousands of documents. Most are reviewed immediately. Routine exhibits, routine evidence, routine disputes. A sealed exhibit is different. It exists outside the ordinary flow of information. Restricted, protected. Usually because its contents may influence the case significantly. Red Alexander arrived at the courthouse shortly before 9. The rain had finally stopped. For the first time in weeks, sunlight appeared over Portland. The change felt noticeable. Not symbolic, just noticeable. After months of legal proceedings, Rhett had stopped looking for symbolism in weather. Reality provided enough material on its own. Courtroom 6B felt quieter than usual. Perhaps because everyone sensed the case approaching a conclusion. Perhaps because fatigue had settled over the proceedings. Even Vanessa appeared exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Months of conflict do that. They wear people down, sometimes long before any ruling arrives. Judge Eleanor Whitaker entered promptly. The hearing resumed. Several procedural issues were addressed first. Minor matters, outstanding disclosures, administrative questions. Nothing significant. Then the discussion returned to the central dispute. Ownership, control, responsibility. The same themes that had dominated the case from the beginning. Charlotte Mercer remained composed. Gregory Whitman appeared thoughtful. Vanessa appeared impatient. The combination created an unusual atmosphere. Judge Whitaker reviewed several notes, then looked toward Gregory. "Counselor," Gregory stood. "Your Honor." The judge folded her hands. "Has your client's position changed regarding ownership of Alexander Ledger Systems?" The question landed heavily. Because everyone knew it wasn't really directed at Gregory, it was directed at Vanessa. The attorney paused. For a moment, Red almost felt sorry for him. Not because Gregory lacked skill, because he had spent months navigating a situation where facts and expectations moved in opposite directions. Finally, he answered, "My client continues seeking ownership." The response sounded formal, professional, yet something inside it felt weaker than before. Judge Whitaker noticed. Charlotte noticed. Rhett noticed. Even Vanessa seemed to notice. The judge nodded, then made another note. Silence followed, brief, meaningful. Eventually Gregory spoke again, this time voluntarily. "Your Honor, I would like to clarify something for the record." That immediately captured everyone's attention. The judge looked up. "Proceed." Gregory adjusted his glasses. The attorney's voice remained steady, but not comfortable. "Throughout these proceedings, I have repeatedly advised my client regarding the operational and legal responsibilities associated with ownership." Vanessa turned toward him. The reaction was immediate, sharp, surprised, almost offended. Gregory continued anyway. "I believe it is important for the record to reflect that those discussions occurred." The courtroom became very quiet. No one moved. Even the court reporter seemed unusually attentive. Judge Whitaker nodded slowly. "Understood." The attorney continued. "My obligation is to advocate for my client while ensuring she understands the consequences of the relief requested." Another pause. Another careful breath. Then the statement that changed the atmosphere entirely. I have encouraged reconsideration on multiple occasions. The words settled over the courtroom. Heavy, unavoidable, honest. Vanessa stared at him. Disbelief flashed across her face. For the first time, the conflict wasn't between spouses. It wasn't even between attorneys. It was between expectation and reality. Rhett watched silently. Years earlier, he might have felt satisfaction. Now he felt something else. Distance. A strange emotional distance from the entire situation. Perhaps because he had already processed the loss long ago. The marriage had ended before the paperwork arrived. The courtroom simply documented it. Judge Whitaker thanked Gregory, then turned toward Vanessa. "Mrs. Alexander, do you wish to respond?" The question created another long silence. Eventually, Vanessa spoke. "Yes." Her voice remained controlled, but only barely. "I believe everyone is making this more complicated than it needs to be." The judge listened. "I supported the company. That has been acknowledged. I helped build the life that allowed the company to grow. That has also been acknowledged." Vanessa nodded, as though building momentum, then continued. "But suddenly, everyone acts like I know nothing." The statement lingered, because beneath the frustration existed something genuine. Not necessarily accurate, but genuine. Rhett recognized that. Years of marriage made certain things difficult to ignore. The problem wasn't that Vanessa contributed nothing. The problem was that contribution and ownership were not the same thing. Support and operation were not the same thing. Presence and responsibility were not the same thing. The legal process had repeatedly returned to that distinction. Judge Whitaker responded carefully. "No one is questioning whether you contributed to the marriage." The judge's voice remained calm. "The issue before the court concerns ownership and responsibility." Again, the same word. Responsibility. It appeared throughout the case like a recurring theme, because it sat at the center of everything. The hearing continued. Additional arguments followed, additional documents, additional clarifications. Yet the momentum had changed. The ownership request no longer felt strong. It felt isolated, unsupported, increasingly disconnected from the evidence surrounding it. Then Charlotte stood. "Your Honor, before we conclude, we'd request review of the sealed exhibit." The room instantly sharpened. There it was, the document everyone had been quietly circling around, the exhibit that remained unopened. Judge Whitaker nodded. "Approved." A clerk approached. The sealed envelope was brought forward. For several moments nobody spoke. The courtroom seemed smaller, more focused. Even Gregory leaned forward slightly. Charlotte accepted the document, then handed copies to the appropriate parties. Rhett had seen it before. Years ago. Long before the divorce. Long before the investigation. Long before any of this began. That was precisely why it mattered. The document wasn't created during litigation. It wasn't prepared strategically. It existed independently of the conflict, which made it powerful. Judge Whitaker began reading. Slowly, carefully. The room remained silent. Several pages passed, then several more. Rhett watched expressions change. First the judge, then Gregory, then Vanessa. Subtle changes, yet unmistakable. Recognition. The document involved corporate governance, ownership structure, management authority, operational responsibility. Years earlier, when Alexander Ledger Systems began expanding rapidly, attorneys had recommended additional liability protections. Formal role definitions, formal responsibility assignments, formal acknowledgments. At the time, nobody considered the paperwork particularly important. Just another legal form, another signature, another administrative requirement. Now it looked very different. because certain sections contained explicit declarations, clear language, unambiguous language, language difficult to reinterpret years later. Judge Whittaker continued reading, then looked toward Vanessa. The expression on the judge's face remained neutral, yet something had clearly shifted. Gregory requested a copy, reviewed several sections, then reviewed them again. The attorney closed his eyes briefly, only for a second. But Rhett noticed, because he understood what Gregory had just found. The document didn't attack Vanessa. It didn't accuse her. It simply preserved a decision she had voluntarily made years earlier. A decision made when responsibility seemed inconvenient. A decision made when liability seemed undesirable. A decision made before the company became significantly more valuable. Those details mattered. A lot. Judge Whittaker finally set the exhibit aside. The silence that followed lasted several seconds, long enough for everyone to understand the significance, short enough to remain professional. Then the judge spoke. "I've reviewed the exhibit." Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. The courtroom waited, because whatever happened next would likely shape the remainder of the case. And judging by the way Gregory stared at the document, he already knew exactly how important it was. Judge Eleanor Whittaker removed her glasses. That small gesture immediately changed the atmosphere inside courtroom 6B. Everyone noticed. Attorneys learned to read judges. Business owners learned to read rooms. Rhett Alexander had spent years doing both. The judge wasn't surprised by what she had read. She was evaluating it. There was a difference. The sealed exhibit remained open before her. Several pages marked with yellow tabs. Several signatures highlighted. Several sections underlined. Nothing dramatic, no hidden recordings, no explosive revelations. Just documentation. The kind Rhett had spent years preserving. The kind most people ignore until they suddenly matter. Judge Whittaker looked toward Charlotte Mercer. "Counselor for the record summarized the exhibit." Charlotte stood immediately. "Yes, Your Honor." She opened her copy, then spoke clearly. Years earlier, when Alexander Ledger Systems expanded beyond Oregon and entered several new healthcare markets outside counsel, had recommended corporate restructuring. The purpose was simple: risk management, liability allocation, operational clarity. The company handled increasingly sensitive healthcare information. Regulatory exposure was growing. Formal documentation became necessary. Judge Whittaker nodded. Charlotte continued. As part of that process, Mr. Alexander and Mrs. Alexander were both advised regarding management responsibilities. The courtroom remained silent. Every word mattered. Specific documents were prepared outlining operational authority, compliance, responsibility, liability, exposure, and executive oversight. Charlotte turned a page, then another. The exhibit contained signed acknowledgments. Again, the word signed. That was what made the document powerful. Not opinions, not recollections. Signatures. Charlotte continued. Mrs. Alexander explicitly declined any operational management role. Across the room, Vanessa remained motionless, but Rhett noticed her hands tighten, only slightly. The attorney continued. She further acknowledged she would not participate in executive decision-making authority. Another page, another signature, another acknowledgement. And she expressly declined legal responsibility associated with company compliance obligations. The final statement settled heavily across the courtroom, because it directly touched the core issue. Responsibility. The same word that had followed the case from beginning to end. Judge Whittaker reviewed the highlighted section again, then looked toward Vanessa. Mrs. Alexander, is this your signature? The question sounded simple, yet everyone knew how important it was. Vanessa examined the document. Several seconds passed, then she answered, yes. No argument, no denial, No explanation. Just yes. The judge nodded. Another fact entered the record. Gregory Whitman remained standing beside counsel table. The attorney looked exhausted. Not physically, professionally, the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching a case gradually collapse under its own contradictions. Judge Whitaker continued. At the time this document was signed, did you understand its contents? Vanessa hesitated, then answered. I relied on legal advice. The judge nodded. A reasonable answer. Another pause, then another question. Did you object to declining those responsibilities? No. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Whitaker made another note. The significance was becoming impossible to ignore. Years earlier, when responsibility looked burdensome, Vanessa had voluntarily declined it. Now, years later, after the company became substantially more valuable, she wanted ownership without acknowledging the responsibilities she previously rejected. The contradiction sat directly inside the record. Clear, documented, signed. Charlotte remained standing. She understood the moment, but she didn't overplay it. That was one reason she was effective. Strong evidence rarely needs dramatic presentation. It speaks for itself. The judge turned toward Gregory. Counselor, the invitation was obvious, an opportunity to respond, to clarify, to challenge, if possible. Gregory stood slowly, then adjusted his glasses. For several seconds he appeared to consider multiple arguments. Eventually, he chose honesty. The exhibit appears authentic, Your Honor. The statement landed hard, because it came from Vanessa's own attorney, not from Charlotte, not from Rhett, from Gregory. The attorney continued. My client signed the document. Another pause. Another uncomfortable truth. The language is clear. Judge Whitaker nodded. No further explanation was necessary. The courtroom understood. So did Vanessa. For the first time since the proceedings began, genuine uncertainty appeared on her face. Not frustration, not anger, something deeper. The realization that reality had become difficult to negotiate with. The hearing continued for another hour. Several remaining issues required resolution. Property valuations, investment accounts, retirement funds, residential assets, standard divorce matters. Yet the emotional center of the case had already shifted. The company, the ownership demand, the argument that drove months of litigation. It no longer looked sustainable. Eventually, Judge Whitaker requested final comments. Charlotte spoke first. Her closing remarks were concise, measured, professional. She emphasized several points. Rhett had built the company before and throughout the marriage. The company possessed substantial value. Vanessa contributed to the marriage. That contribution deserved recognition, but ownership and responsibility remained inseparable. The evidence consistently demonstrated that reality. Nothing more needed to be said. Gregory followed. His remarks surprised Rhett, not because they were dramatic, because they were responsible. The attorney did not attempt impossible arguments, did not distort evidence, did not pretend the sealed exhibit didn't exist. Instead, he focused on equitable distribution, fair compensation, reasonable recognition of marital contributions. It was the argument of a lawyer who understood where the facts led and respected them. Judge Whitaker thanked both attorneys, then announced a brief recess before ruling. The courtroom emptied slowly. People stretched, gathered papers, checked phones. Outside sunlight filtered through the courthouse windows. The storm that had dominated Portland for weeks finally seemed to be breaking. Rhett stood near a hallway window, watching traffic move below. Charlotte approached. You all right? He nodded. Yes. The attorney studied him briefly. Most people would be celebrating already. Rhett almost smiled. There isn't anything to celebrate. Charlotte understood immediately. Winning a legal dispute doesn't restore a marriage. It doesn't recover lost years. It simply resolves a dispute. Nothing more, nothing less. 25 minutes later, everyone returned. Judge Whitaker entered. The courtroom rose, then sat. The ruling began. Methodical, detailed, professional. The judge summarized the evidence, corporate records, ownership documents, operational responsibilities, financial disclosures, regulatory obligations. The analysis took nearly 20 minutes. No theatrics, no dramatic speeches, just reasoning, the way justice usually works in reality. Finally, Judge Whitaker reached her conclusion. The courtroom became perfectly still. Alexander Ledger Systems shall remain under the ownership and control of Mr. Rhett Alexander. The words felt almost anticlimactic, because everyone already knew they were coming, yet hearing them mattered. The judge continued. Mrs. Alexander would receive substantial compensation through equitable distribution of marital assets, investment allocations, property adjustments, financial settlements, recognition of her contributions to the marriage, but not ownership of the company, not operational control, not management authority. The reasoning was clear. Responsibility had remained with Rhett. Documentation proved it. Operational expertise proved it. Years of conduct proved it. The ruling concluded shortly afterward. Judge Whitaker exited. The hearing ended. Months of conflict collapsed into a few pages of final orders, just like that. People began leaving. Attorneys packed documents. Court staff moved efficiently. Conversations resumed. Normal life returned. Vanessa remained seated briefly. Longer than everyone else, Rhett noticed, not because he watched her directly, because silence has weight. And hers felt heavy. Eventually she stood, collected her things, then walked toward the exit. No dramatic scene, no final argument, no public breakdown, just departure. For years she had controlled the narrative within social circles, within gatherings, within appearances. Now the narrative belonged to records, to evidence, to documented reality, and there was nothing left to argue with. As Vanessa disappeared through the courtroom doors, Gregory followed quietly behind her. Charlotte gathered the final binder, then looked toward Rhett. "It's over." Rhett glanced toward the now empty judge's bench. For the first time in months, the courtroom felt completely silent. Not tense, not hostile, simply finished. And as he stood there, surrounded by boxes of documents that had ultimately decided everything, he realized something unexpected. The company had survived. The truth had survived. And now, finally, life could move forward. 3 weeks after the ruling, the parking lot outside Alexander Ledger Systems looked exactly the same. That surprised Rhett Alexander, not because he expected celebration, because major life events often create the illusion that everything should feel different afterward. The reality was less dramatic. Employees still arrived before 8. Coffee still disappeared too quickly. Support tickets still filled inboxes. Developers still argued over implementation details. The company continued doing what it had always done, working. There was comfort in that. On a cold Monday morning, Rhett parked his aging Toyota Tacoma in the same corner space he had used for years. The truck had survived 12 Oregon winters, a few scratches, a few dents, nothing impressive. Exactly the way he liked it. He stepped out into the crisp air and walked toward the office. No reporters waited. No cameras appeared. No public victory existed to document. The legal battle had ended quietly, which felt appropriate. The truth rarely arrives with fireworks. Inside the building, employees moved through their routines. A few offered simple greetings. Nothing unusual, nothing forced. Rhett appreciated that more than any celebration. Near his office door, he found a paper coffee cup sitting on the floor. No note, no explanation, just coffee. Daniel Price appeared moments later. The CFO noticed the cup and laughed. "Somebody beat me to it." Rhett picked it up. "Apparently." Daniel shrugged. "People are happy you're still here." The statement sounded simple, yet it carried meaning. Not because Rhett feared losing the company, because employees had spent months watching uncertainty unfold around them. Even when leadership projects confidence people notice tension. They notice rumors. They notice risk. The ruling ended that uncertainty. And stability matters, especially in healthcare technology. The morning meeting focused on ordinary business, client renewals, product updates, compliance reviews, operational targets. Everything felt refreshingly normal. Halfway through the meeting, Daniel presented a new report. Northwest Health Alliance, the contract everyone had spent months pursuing. The room immediately paid attention. The partnership represented one of the largest opportunities in company history. Not because of the money, because of what it represented. Trust, scale, credibility. Daniel smiled, then slid a document across the table. Rhett reviewed it. Once, then twice. The final agreement had been approved. Fully executed. Multi-year commitment. Long-term partnership. Years of work condensed into a few signatures. The room erupted into applause. Not wild applause. Not corporate theater. Genuine appreciation. Several employees had spent years helping build toward that moment. Now it was real. Rhett thanked everyone. Briefly, then moved the discussion forward. Business continued, as it always did. That evening, long after most employees left, Rhett remained in his office. The building had grown quiet. Outside, Portland traffic moved through the fading light. The city looked peaceful. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a moment to think. Not about the lawsuit, not about the divorce, about the years before everything changed. The garage, the folding table, the cheap monitors, the impossible deadlines, the first customer, the first employee, the first office, 12 years, an entire chapter of life. Some memories felt distant, others remained vivid. Certain losses still existed. Winning a court case doesn't erase disappointment. It doesn't erase betrayal. It doesn't erase regret. Those things remain. They simply stop controlling the future. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel stood in the doorway. "Still here," Rhett smiled. "Barely." The CFO stepped inside. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel looked around the office. "You know something." "What?" "You never actually fought back." The observation surprised Rhett. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "Most people would have." He wasn't wrong. Most people would have launched public attacks, posted evidence online, destroyed reputations, started wars. Rhett never did. Daniel shook his head. "You just kept collecting records." Rhett looked toward the city lights outside. "Records don't argue." The answer seemed to amuse Daniel. "That's probably the most Rhett Alexander thing I've ever heard." Both men laughed quietly. The conversation ended there, because nothing more needed to be said. A month later, another change arrived. Rhett sold the old house, not because he had to, because he wanted to. Too many memories lived there, some good, some painful, most complicated. The new place sat on the outskirts of Portland, smaller, simpler, a modern home overlooking a wooded hillside. No grand entrance, no luxury statement, just peace. The first night there, Rhett sat on the back deck watching sunlight disappear beyond the trees. No conference calls, no legal filings, no settlement meetings. Just silence. Real silence. The kind he hadn't experienced in years. He found he liked it. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm. Work, home, occasional dinners with friends, weekend hikes, normal things, healthy things. The divorce faded into history. Not forgotten, just no longer central. Every so often, someone asked about it. A business contact, an acquaintance, a distant friend. Rhett's answer remained consistent. It's finished. Then he changed the subject, because the future interested him more than the past. 6 months after the ruling, Alexander Ledger Systems held its annual company gathering. Nothing extravagant. A renovated event space near the river. Employees, families, partners, friends. The atmosphere felt relaxed. For much of the evening, Rhett stayed near the edges of the room. As usual, observing, listening. The same habits never disappeared. Late in the event, Thomas Reed approached carrying 2 glasses of bourbon. He handed one to Rhett. The older investor smiled. You know, people keep asking how you survived all that. Rhett took a sip. What do you tell them? Thomas laughed. The truth. And the investor looked around the room, at the employees, the families, the company, the future, then answered. I tell them you built something real. The words stayed with Rhett, because they explained everything. The company survived because it was real. The contracts were real. The employees were real. The clients were real. The work was real. And ultimately, reality proved stronger than appearances, stronger than assumptions, stronger than rumors. Several months later, on an ordinary Friday evening, Rhett remained in the office after everyone else had left. The building was quiet, almost completely silent. The final security notifications appeared on his monitor. The day's work was finished. Outside the windows, Portland glowed beneath the orange light of sunset. The city looked beautiful, calm, steady. Rhett stood, gathered a few documents, turned off his desk lamp, then walked slowly through the office, past workstations, past conference rooms, past the reception area, the same company, the same building, the same mission. Yet somehow, everything felt lighter. At the front entrance, he paused briefly. Behind him, Alexander Ledger Systems rested in darkness. Ahead of him, the parking lot stretched beneath the fading evening sky. He locked the door, slipped the keys into his pocket, then walked toward the old Tacoma waiting near the curb. No audience, no applause, no victory speech. Just a quiet man heading home after another day of work. And for the first time in a very long time, that was more than enough. There is a reason quiet people are often underestimated. Most of the world pays attention to noise. It notices confidence appearances and bold claims. What it often misses is preparation. Rhett Alexander never won because he argued louder. He won because he spent years building something real and documenting the truth while others focused on perception. When the pressure finally arrived, he didn't need a better story. He already had evidence. Many of us face moments when we feel misunderstood, overlooked, or unfairly judged. It can happen in business relationships, friendships, or even within our own families. The temptation is always the same. React immediately, defend yourself, prove people wrong. But sometimes the strongest response is not an emotional one. Sometimes it is patience. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes it is quietly continuing to do the work until reality speaks for itself. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your value? Did you fight back immediately, or did you let time and results speak for you? Share your experience in the comments. Stories like yours often help other people going through similar situations. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story follows another ordinary person who was completely misunderstood until one unexpected moment revealed who they really were.